My name is Mercedes Wilson, and at 32 years old, I never imagined I would be fired from my financial analyst position at Blair Investments for simply doing my job. I discovered a critical flaw in our biggest project that could sink the entire company. When I brought it to my boss, Richard Anderson, he smirked and said those words I will never forget. "Bring me a solution, not a problem." Little did he know my solution would change both our lives forever. If you are watching this video, let me know where you are tuning in from. In the comments below, hit that like button and subscribe to hear how I went from being fired to owning the company that wronged me. I had been working at Blair Investments for almost 5 years when everything fell apart. Blair was a mid-sized financial firm with about 200 employees based in Chicago. We specialized in managing investment portfolios for medium-sized businesses and high-net-worth individuals. Despite not being one of the Wall Street giants, we had been growing steadily and had earned a reputation for solid, if somewhat conservative, financial management. I joined right after finishing my MBA at Northwestern, eager to put my analytical skills to good use. From the outside, Blair Investments looked like a dream workplace. Modern offices in a prestigious downtown building, competitive salaries and impressive client lists that would look good on any resume. The company brochures and website showcased diverse, smiling employees and testimonials about our supportive work culture, but reality told a different story. Richard Anderson, the Chief Operations Officer and my direct supervisor, was the perfect example of failing upward in corporate America. He was tall, conventionally handsome, and had the kind of confidence that often gets mistaken for competence. He had an MBA from an Ivy League school and never missed an opportunity to mention it. Richard came from a wealthy family with connections throughout the financial industry, which explained how he had risen to his position despite his mediocre performance and terrible management style. The toxic culture at Blair started and ended with Richard. He created an environment where questioning his decisions was seen as insubordination. During meetings, he would ask for input, but then belittle anyone who offered ideas that contradicted his own. He took credit for successful initiatives while blaming failures on his team. Several talented analysts had left the company after becoming targets of his public humiliation. Remember, in finance, perception is reality. Richard would often say, especially when suggesting we present data in ways that painted the rosiest possible picture for clients. He never explicitly asked us to falsify information, but the pressure to make numbers look good was constant and intense. Despite the challenges I had managed to build, relationships with a few colleagues who shared my frustration with the company culture. Lisa Parker from marketing became a close friend after we bonded during a particularly brutal quarterly review where Richard had torn apart her presentation. James Rodriguez from IT was another ally, often helping me access the data I needed for my analyses when official channels were too slow. "Richard is a nightmare, but the company has potential," Lisa would say during our lunch breaks. "If leadership ever changes, this could actually be a great place to work." I genuinely loved financial analysis. There was something deeply satisfying about diving into complex data sets, identifying patterns, and using that information to make strategic recommendations. My performance reviews, even from Richard, acknowledged my technical skills, though he often noted I needed to be more of a team player, which I knew was code for stop questioning my judgment. 7 months ago, Blair Investments landed its biggest client, yet Westbrook Industries, a manufacturing conglomerate looking to diversify its investments. Landing Westbrook was considered a major coup, and Richard took full credit, though many of us had worked nights and weekends preparing the pitch materials. The Westbrook account would potentially double our management portfolio, and Richard was determined to make it his crowning achievement. The Westbrook project required a complex restructuring of several investment vehicles, along with some creative financing solutions that made me uncomfortable from the beginning. I was assigned to lead the financial analysis team for the project, reporting directly to Richard. The timeline was aggressive, with major financial commitments needing to be made within 3 months. 2 months into the project, while reviewing some projection models, I discovered a serious flaw in our approach. The cash flow projections were based on overly optimistic market assumptions, and the risk assessment had significant blind spots. Worse, our liquidity buffers were dangerously thin. If market conditions shifted even slightly in the wrong direction, both Westbrook and Blair could face devastating losses. I double-checked my analysis, ran alternative scenarios, and consulted financial regulations to confirm my concerns. Every approach led to the same conclusion: we were heading for potential disaster, and nobody seemed to notice or care. That night I barely slept, knowing what I had to do the next day would likely make me extremely unpopular with Richard, and possibly jeopardize my position at the company. But the alternative, staying silent, could ruin countless lives if the financial house of cards collapsed. The morning after my discovery, I arrived at the office earlier than usual. The financial district was just waking up, with coffee shops filling with the usual crowd of suited professionals preparing for another day of meetings and deadlines. I needed quiet time to organize my findings before others arrived, and the daily chaos began. I spread my analysis across my desk, reviewing each calculation and projection one more time. The problem centered around three critical flaws in the Westbrook project structure. First, our liquidity projections assumed we could convert certain assets to cash quickly, but my research showed those particular markets had become significantly less liquid in recent months. Second, our risk models failed to account for correlation factors between different investment vehicles, essentially ignoring how one failure could trigger others. Third, and most alarming, was that the documentation being prepared for regulatory review glossed over these issues with vague language and selective data presentation. By 8:30, Lisa arrived and immediately noticed my stressed expression. "You look like you have seen a ghost," she said, placing her coffee on my desk and pulling up a chair. I explained my findings in detail, showing her the spreadsheets and risk models. While marketing wasn't her specialty, Lisa had been at Blair long enough to understand the implications. "This is serious, Mercedes," she said, her voice lowered, despite the office being mostly empty. "If these projections are right, we could be looking at regulatory violations, not just bad business decisions." "I know. That is why I have to take this to Richard today." Lisa grimaced. "You know how he responds to bad news. Remember what happened to Anthony when he questioned the Parker account structure." Anthony Harris had been a senior analyst who raised concerns about another project 6 months earlier. Richard had sidelined him, excluded him from meetings, and eventually Anthony resigned, unable to withstand the hostility. "This is different," I insisted. "The potential harm is too significant. I would rather lose my job than be complicit in financial misconduct." As more colleagues arrived, I sought out James from IT. His technical understanding would provide another perspective on my findings. We met in the small conference room on the 20th floor, away from curious eyes. James reviewed my analysis carefully, occasionally asking clarifying questions. His expression grew increasingly troubled. "Your math checks out," he finally said. "And I can tell you something else concerning. I was pulling server logs last week and noticed unusual patterns in how financial data is being stored and transferred. Some of the Westbrook files are being kept on private servers outside our normal security protocols." This revelation added another layer of concern. Why would project files be stored outside normal channels unless someone wanted to limit who could access them? During lunch, I called Amanda Chen, my former supervisor, who had left Blair 2 years earlier. Amanda had worked with Richard longer than anyone else I knew, and had often served as a buffer between his worst impulses and the team. "Be extremely careful," Mercedes, Amanda warned after hearing my situation. "Richard views bearers of bad news as personal enemies. Document everything, keep copies of your analysis outside the company system, and consider having someone else present when you speak with him." "I have all my documentation ready, but Richard rarely allows others in for one-on-one meetings," I explained. "Then record the meeting if your state allows it," she suggested. "Illinois is a 2-party consent state for recordings, so you cannot legally record without his knowledge. But take detailed notes immediately afterward and email them to yourself. Create a paper trail." I spent the afternoon preparing a comprehensive presentation that not only outlined the problems, but offered 3 potential solutions. One involved restructuring the investment vehicles to increase liquidity buffers. Another suggested a more gradual implementation approach. And the third recommended bringing in external compliance consultants to ensure regulatory requirements were properly addressed. By 5:30, most employees had left for the day. Richard typically stayed late, using the quiet evening hours to review reports and prepare for the next day. I sent him a message requesting a meeting to discuss urgent concerns about the Westbrook project structure. His response came quickly. "My office. 15 minutes." I gathered my materials, took a deep breath, and tried to calm my racing heart. In the bathroom mirror, I straightened my blazer and reminded myself that I was doing the right thing both ethically and professionally. Whatever happened next, I would know I had acted with integrity. As I walked toward Richard's corner office, I mentally rehearsed my opening statement one more time. The evening sun cast long shadows across the empty workstations. Through the glass walls of his office, I could see Richard reviewing documents, his expression stern as usual. This conversation would change everything, though I had no idea just how dramatically at the time. I knocked on Richard's door at exactly 5:45. He looked up, gesturing for me to enter without a smile or greeting. His office was immaculate, as always, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering spectacular views of downtown Chicago. Awards and degrees covered one wall, while another displayed photographs of Richard with various business leaders and politicians, visual reminders of his connections and status. "Make this quick, Mercedes. I have dinner with the Westbrook executives in an hour," he said, not bothering to look up from his computer. "Thank you for making time, Richard." I began taking a seat across from his massive desk. "I have identified some serious concerns with the Westbrook project structure that require immediate attention." That got his attention. He finally looked at me, his expression shifting from annoyance to something harder. "What kind of concerns?" he asked, his tone already defensive. I opened my laptop and turned it so he could see my presentation. "I've been reviewing the liquidity projections and risk assessments for the primary investment vehicles, and I've found some significant discrepancies between our models and current market conditions." For the next 10 minutes, I walked him through my findings, carefully explaining each point with supporting data. I showed him the comparative market analyses, the liquidity risk projections, and the regulatory guidelines that our current approach potentially violated. Throughout my presentation, Richard remained silent, his expression growing increasingly cold. When I finished explaining the problems, I immediately transitioned to my proposed solutions. "I've developed 3 alternative approaches that would address these issues while still meeting Westbrook's core objectives," I explained, moving to that section of my presentation. Richard raised his hand, stopping me. "Let me get this straight. 2 days before our major implementation meeting with Westbrook, you're suggesting we tell them our entire approach is flawed." "Not flawed in concept," I clarified, "but requiring significant adjustments to mitigate unnecessary risks. These changes would actually strengthen the long-term viability of the project." Richard leaned back in his chair, studying me with narrowed eyes. "Do you have any idea how hard I worked to land Westbrook? The promises I made to their board? I understand the importance of this client, which is precisely why we need to address these issues now before implementation begins. If these problems surface later, the consequences could be far worse." Richard stood abruptly and walked to the window, his back to me. For a moment, the office was completely silent, except for the faint hum of the ventilation system. When he turned back, his face had transformed into a mask of condescending amusement. "Bring me a solution, not a problem," he said with a smirk that made my stomach tighten. "I did bring solutions," I replied, gesturing to my laptop screen. 3 viable alternatives that would reduce risk while maintaining profitability. His smirk widened. "Those aren't solutions, Mercedes. Those are admissions of failure dressed up as alternatives. Solutions don't involve admitting defeat before we've even begun." "Recognizing and addressing risks isn't admitting defeat," I countered, struggling to keep my voice calm. "It's responsible financial management." Richard returned to his desk, towering over me. "This is exactly why you'll never advance beyond analyst Mercedes. You're too negative, always looking for what might go wrong, instead of focusing on opportunities. My job is to identify and mitigate financial risks. That's literally what you hired me to do. I hired you to support the company's objectives, not undermine major client relationships with doomsday scenarios." Richard's voice had risen, his face flushing with anger. "This is why women often struggle in finance. Too much emotion, not enough strategic thinking." The blatant sexism stunned me momentarily. In 5 years, he had never been quite so explicit with his bias, though it had always bubbled beneath the surface. "My analysis is based on data and regulatory guidelines, not emotion," I responded, my own anger now evident, and suggesting otherwise is both unprofessional and discriminatory. Richard's eyes widened at my challenge. He wasn't used to subordinates standing their ground. "You know what your problem is. You're not a team player. Never have been. Always thinking you know better than everyone else, including your superiors." He shuffled some papers on his desk, visibly trying to regain composure. "The Westbrook project is proceeding as planned. Your concerns are noted but overruled. If we proceed with the current structure, we're exposing both Blair and Westbrook to unnecessary risks that could violate SEC regulations, I insisted. I can't in good conscience support that direction without formally registering my objections. Richard's face darkened. Are you threatening me with some kind of whistleblower nonsense? I'm trying to protect the company and our clients, I said. That's my fiduciary responsibility. Your responsibility is to follow the directions set by management. Richard's voice had become dangerously quiet. But it seems you're incapable of that basic requirement. He opened his desk drawer and pulled out a folder, sliding it across the desk toward me. I was hoping you might eventually grow into the team culture here, but clearly that's not happening. I opened the folder to find termination paperwork already filled out with today's date. The reason for termination listed was inability to meet performance expectations and insubordination. You prepared this before our meeting, I asked, shock washing over me. Let's call it being prepared for contingencies, something you should appreciate given your obsession with risk. His smile was cold and triumphant. Security will escort you to clear your desk. Your access to company systems has already been revoked. I sat frozen, unable to fully process what was happening. You're firing me for doing my job, for protecting the company from potential regulatory violations. I'm firing you for consistently undermining leadership and failing to align with company objectives. Your final paycheck and severance details are in the folder. 1 month's salary contingent on signing the non-disclosure agreement also included. As if on cue, the office door opened and Ted from security appeared. Richard must have messaged him while we were talking. Please escort Miss Wilson to her desk to collect personal belongings, then to the exit, Richard instructed Ted. Ensure she returns her keycard and company devices. I stood on shaky legs, clutching my laptop and the termination folder. This is a mistake, Richard. One you'll regret. The only mistake was thinking you could ever fit in here, he replied, already turning his attention back to his computer. Good luck with your future endeavors. Ted looked uncomfortable but professional as he walked me to my desk. Word had somehow already spread as the few remaining colleagues watched with wide eyes as I mechanically packed my personal items into a cardboard box. Lisa appeared at my side, her face stricken. What happened? She whispered. I'll call you later, I managed to say, too overwhelmed to explain in front of others. 20 minutes later, I stood on the sidewalk outside the Blair building, holding a box containing 5 years of my professional life, without even the dignity of deciding when and how to say goodbye to my colleagues. As the shock began to wear off, it was replaced by a burning mixture of humiliation, rage, and fear about my uncertain future. Little did I know that this devastating moment would ultimately lead to the greatest opportunity of my career. The first week after being fired was a blur of emotions. I alternated between fits of angry tears and numb disbelief. My apartment, normally a sanctuary, became a prison of rumination, where I replayed the confrontation with Richard endlessly in my mind, thinking of all the things I should have said or done differently. I hardly slept, and when I did, I had anxiety dreams about being publicly humiliated in front of the entire company. The financial impact was immediately concerning. Chicago isn't cheap, and while I had savings, the job market in specialized financial analysis could be unpredictable. I calculated that without drastic cutbacks, my emergency fund would last about 4 months. I had always been financially prudent, but the prospect of depleting my carefully built safety net terrified me. You did the right thing, my mother insisted during our daily calls. She lived in Detroit and offered to let me move back home temporarily, but at 32, that option felt like an admission of complete defeat. Standing up for what's right might cost you in the short term, but integrity always pays off eventually. I wanted to believe her, but doubt crept in during my darkest moments. Had I been too rigid, too naive about how the financial world really operated, Richard's words about why women struggle in finance echoed painfully, making me question whether I had somehow failed to navigate the unwritten rules of a male-dominated industry. 3 days after being fired, Lisa called me from a coffee shop near the office. I can't talk long, she said, her voice hushed. But you should know things are chaotic here. Richard told everyone you were fired for insubordination and poor performance, but nobody who's worked with you believes it. Has anything changed with the Westbrook project? I asked. That's why I'm calling. James managed to access some of the latest reports. The issues you identified are getting worse. Some of the senior analysts are raising concerns now, but Richard is shutting them down hard. He's moved the implementation timeline up, apparently trying to lock everything in before anyone can examine the structure too closely. This news rekindled my anger. It wasn't just my career that had been damaged. Real people could be harmed if the project collapsed as I predicted. By the second week, I forced myself to begin applying for new positions. I updated my resume careful to frame my departure from Blair in neutral terms. I reached out to my professional network, avoiding details but letting contacts know I was on the market. Several expressed surprise, knowing my reputation for excellence, but job leads were sparse. The financial sector in Chicago was tight-knit, and I worried that Richard might be poisoning the well behind the scenes. During this period, I received occasional texts from James and Lisa, keeping me updated on the deteriorating situation at Blair. James had discovered that Richard was presenting altered versions of key risk assessments to both the executive team and Westbrook representatives. The deception was more deliberate than I had initially suspected. Then came the pivotal moment that would change everything. 3 weeks after my firing, I was having coffee at a small cafe in Lincoln Park, reviewing job listings on my laptop when someone approached my table. Mercedes Wilson, a deep voice asked. I looked up to see a tall black man in his 40s, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit that even my distracted mind registered as expensive. Yes, I replied cautiously. Benjamin Taylor, Sterling Financial, he said, extending his hand. May I join you for a moment? Sterling Financial was Blair's largest competitor in our market segment, a fact that immediately raised my suspicions. I gestured to the empty chair across from me, curiosity overcoming caution. I'll be direct, Benjamin said after ordering an espresso. Your name has come up in several interesting contexts recently. Word travels fast in financial circles, especially about talented analysts being abruptly terminated. I maintained a neutral expression. I'm not comfortable discussing my former employer. Benjamin smiled. Understandable and commendable. Professional discretion is rare these days. He handed me his business card, heavy stock with understated embossing. I'm not here to gossip. I'm here because Sterling is interested in your expertise, particularly regarding certain market sectors where Blair has recently expanded. If you're asking me to violate confidentiality agreements, I'm afraid you've misjudged me, I said firmly. Not at all. I'm asking you to consider bringing your analytical skills to Sterling where they might be more appreciated. He paused, studying me. And perhaps in the proper context and within appropriate legal boundaries, sharing insights about market risks that could affect the broader financial ecosystem. The careful phrasing caught my attention. He wasn't asking for proprietary information, but rather my professional assessment of market conditions related to Blair's activities. Why would Sterling be interested in my perspective specifically, I asked. Benjamin's expression became more serious. Let's just say certain investment structures currently being implemented have raised red flags among our risk assessment team. We've been monitoring similar patterns across several firms and are concerned about systemic implications. The conversation continued for nearly an hour. Benjamin was careful never to ask directly about Blair's internal operations, focusing instead on my expertise and career aspirations. By the end, he had offered me an interview with Sterling's executive team and hinted that they were very interested in my perspective on current market risks. That night, I wrestled with the ethical implications. Would sharing my analysis of the Westbrook project's flaws constitute a betrayal of confidentiality, or was it my professional duty to prevent potential market harm and regulatory violations? I reviewed my termination agreement carefully. While it prohibited sharing proprietary client information, it didn't prevent me from discussing my own analysis of publicly available market data or general investment structures. After a mostly sleepless night, I called Benjamin the next morning and accepted his invitation to meet with Sterling's leadership team. Whatever happened, I decided I needed to hear what they had to say. 3 days later, I received an email with flight details. Sterling was flying me first class to their headquarters in Boston for a meeting with their executive leadership. As I packed my most professional outfit and prepared my presentation materials, I felt a strange mixture of vindication and trepidation. This could either be the opportunity of a lifetime or a complicated ethical trap. Either way, it represented my first step toward reclaiming my professional identity after Richard had tried to destroy it. The Sterling Financial headquarters occupied the top 10 floors of a gleaming tower in Boston's financial district. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered panoramic views of the harbor, while the interior featured a tasteful blend of modern design and traditional elements that conveyed stability and innovation simultaneously. My first-class flight had been just the beginning of Sterling's red carpet treatment. A car service had met me at the airport, and I was now being escorted to the executive conference room by Benjamin's assistant, a poised young woman named Rachel. "The executive team is looking forward to meeting you," Rachel said as we rode the elevator to the 48th floor. "Your background impressed them considerably." The conference room was already occupied when we arrived. Benjamin rose to greet me, then introduced me to 5 other executives, seated around the polished walnut table. Among them was Eleanor Mitchell Sterling, CEO, a woman in her 50s with silver-streaked hair and penetrating blue eyes. "Miss Wilson, thank you for joining us," Eleanor said, gesturing to an empty seat beside her. "Benjamin speaks very highly of your analytical capabilities." "Thank you for the invitation," I replied, trying to project confidence despite my nerves. "I admit I'm curious about Sterling's interest in my perspective." Eleanor nodded to Benjamin, who activated a screen on the wall, displaying what I immediately recognized as Blair's investment portfolio structure, specifically focused on the types of vehicles being used for the Westbrook project. For the past 8 months, Sterling has been tracking an unusual pattern of high-risk investment structures being implemented by several mid-sized firms, including Blair Investments, Benjamin explained. "Our concern is that these structures contain hidden systemic risks that could cascade across market segments if certain conditions arise." What followed was a detailed presentation of Sterling's analysis, which aligned disturbingly well with my own findings. They had identified the same liquidity issues, the same regulatory gray areas, and the same potential for catastrophic failure under stress conditions. "What we don't fully understand," Eleanor said after Benjamin concluded, "is why Blair would implement such a precarious structure for their largest client. It seems recklessly short-sighted." This was the moment of truth. I could offer vague observations, or I could be completely honest about what I knew. After a moment's hesitation, I chose honesty. Blair's COO, Richard Anderson, has created a culture where challenging his decisions is career suicide, I explained. He values perception over reality, and short-term wins over sustainable growth. The Westbrook account is his crowning achievement, and he won't allow anything to jeopardize it, including legitimate risk assessment. I proceeded to share my analysis of the Westbrook project structure, careful to focus on my own work and publicly available information rather than internal communications or proprietary client data. I explained how I had identified the issues, presented them to leadership, and was terminated as a result. The room was silent when I finished. Eleanor and the other executives exchanged glances that seemed to confirm something they had suspected. "Miss Wilson," Eleanor finally said, "would you be interested in joining Sterling Financial as our Director of Risk Analysis? We need someone with both technical expertise and the courage to speak truth to power qualities you've demonstrated." Abundantly. The offer was unexpected and overwhelming. The position represented a significant promotion from my role at Blair, with substantially higher compensation and greater authority. I would need to understand more about Sterling's approach to risk management and ethical standards, I replied cautiously. Eleanor smiled. A perfect response. "I'd be concerned if you accepted without due diligence." Over the next 2 days, I met with various Sterling teams, reviewed their compliance frameworks, and observed their operations. Unlike Blair's culture of fear and obedience, Sterling encouraged robust debate and prioritized ethical considerations alongside profitability. By the end of my visit, I was convinced that the opportunity was genuine. I accepted the position and began 2 weeks later. My first assignment was to lead a specialized team analyzing Blair's investment activities and their potential market impacts. Sterling provided resources far beyond what I had access to at Blair, including sophisticated modeling software and a team of 6 analysts dedicated to the project. With this enhanced capability, we uncovered problems far more serious than I had initially identified. The Westbrook project was just the tip of the iceberg. Blair had been implementing similar high-risk structures across multiple client portfolios, creating a precarious house of cards that could collapse with even minor market fluctuations. One evening, about a month into my new role, I received a text from James. "Things falling apart here. R, in panic mode. W, asking hard questions. Call me." I called immediately. James answered in a whisper, clearly hiding in some corner of the Blair offices. Mercedes, it's getting crazy, he said. Westbrook's CFO brought in external auditors who started asking questions about the exact issues you identified. Richard is trying to blame the implementation team, but some of the senior people are pushing back, saying they raised concerns that were ignored. Has Richard mentioned me? I asked. Not directly, but he keeps ranting about disloyal employees spreading misinformation. The executive team is in emergency meetings every day. There are rumors Westbrook might pull their business entirely. This information confirmed what our analysis at Sterling had suggested. The house of cards was beginning to collapse, and Richard was scrambling to find scapegoats. The next morning, I shared this update with Benjamin and Eleanor during our weekly strategy meeting. Eleanor listened intently, then asked a question that would set the next phase in motion. Given what we now know about Blair's vulnerability, how would you assess their valuation if acquisition were being considered? The question startled me. You're thinking of acquiring Blair. Benjamin nodded. We've been considering strategic expansion options. Blair has a solid client base and market presence despite their current leadership issues. With proper management and risk controls, their business could be stabilized and integrated into our operations. And their current situation might make them available at an advantageous price, Eleanor added pragmatically. The idea of Sterling acquiring Blair, potentially putting me in a position of authority over the company that had fired me, was dizzying. It would be a dramatic reversal of fortune that I could never have imagined 3 months earlier. I would need to recuse myself from certain aspects due to potential conflicts of interest, I said, but I can certainly provide objective analysis of their market position and portfolio structures. That's exactly what we need, Eleanor agreed. Complete objectivity in assessing the business fundamentals separate from any personal history. Over the next 2 weeks, my team conducted a comprehensive valuation analysis of Blair Investments. We determined that while the company had significant underlying value in its client relationships and market position, the current risk exposure had severely compromised its financial stability. In short, Blair was worth acquiring, but at a steep discount to what would have been its value 6 months earlier. Sterling's executive team made the decision to pursue acquisition setting in motion events that would bring me face-to-face with Richard Anderson once again, this time from a position of strength rather than vulnerability. The Sterling acquisition team moved with remarkable efficiency once the decision was made. Within days, preliminary overtures were made to Blair's board of directors, suggesting exploratory discussions about potential strategic partnership opportunities. The carefully worded proposal avoided any language suggesting financial distress or rescue, focusing instead on market synergies and growth potential. My role in the process was carefully structured to minimize potential legal complications. I would not participate in direct negotiations, but would provide analytical support to the Sterling team regarding market conditions and general investment structures. My specific knowledge of Blair would be used only to help Sterling's due diligence team know where to look, not what they would find. Eleanor was particularly careful about this separation. We want this acquisition to be bulletproof from a legal standpoint, she explained during a planning session. No one should be able to claim we used insider information inappropriately. The initial response from Blair's board was cautious but interested. According to Benjamin, who led the first exploratory call, they were receptive to discussions, but insisted that any serious negotiations would need to include their executive leadership team, particularly Richard Anderson, as COO. They're positioning Anderson as essential to their operations, Benjamin reported back, describing him as the architect of their recent growth strategy. I couldn't help but laugh at the irony. He's also the architect of their current crisis, whether they realize it yet or not. As Sterling's due diligence process began, I struggled with conflicting emotions. Part of me felt vindicated that my analysis was being proven correct. Another part felt genuine concern for my former colleagues who might face uncertainty if the acquisition proceeded. I still exchanged occasional texts with Lisa and James, careful never to mention Sterling's interest, but staying informed about the deteriorating conditions at Blair. 3 more people from the analysis team quit this week, Lisa texted one evening. Richard's blaming everyone but himself for the Westbrook problems. According to James, Westbrook had indeed pulled back significantly, freezing implementation of the new investment structure pending a comprehensive third-party audit. Other clients were beginning to ask uncomfortable questions as well, creating a slowly unfolding crisis of confidence. 4 weeks into the process, Sterling's due diligence team uncovered exactly what we had anticipated. Blair's financial position was far more precarious than their public statements suggested. The high-risk investment structures had created vulnerability throughout their portfolio, and several major clients were on the verge of withdrawing their business entirely. With this information in hand, Sterling revised its acquisition offer dramatically downward. What had begun as a potential merger of equals was now clearly a rescue acquisition at pennies on the dollar. Blair's board, now fully aware of their vulnerability, requested an emergency meeting with Sterling's leadership team. "I want you in that meeting," Eleanor told me the day before it was scheduled. "Are you sure that's wise?" I asked, surprised, given my history with Richard. Eleanor's expression was resolute, precisely because of that history. Richard Anderson needs to understand that his actions have consequences. Besides, your analysis is central to our valuation position. No one can present it more effectively than you. The meeting was scheduled at a neutral location, a conference room at the Four Seasons Hotel in Chicago. Sterling's team arrived first, setting up presentation materials and reviewing strategy. I felt strangely calm as I prepared my portion of the presentation, organizing the data that demonstrated exactly how and why Blair's current financial structure was unsustainable. At precisely 2 o'clock, the Blair contingent arrived. The board chairman entered first, followed by their CEO, their legal counsel, and finally, Richard Anderson. His confident stride faltered visibly when he spotted me sitting at the Sterling side of the table. His face flushed red, and he leaned over to whisper urgently to their CEO, who shook his head sharply in response. Eleanor opened the meeting with diplomatic pleasantries, thanking everyone for gathering on short notice. She then introduced the Sterling team, including me, as our Director of Risk Analysis, Mercedes Wilson, who will be presenting our market assessment. Richard's expression was a storm of barely contained rage and disbelief. I maintained perfect professional composure as I met his gaze briefly before turning my attention to my presentation materials. The Blair chairman spoke next. "Before we proceed, I feel I should acknowledge the unusual circumstance of Miss Wilson's involvement, given her recent history with our organization. If you're concerned about the objectivity of our analysis, I can assure you it has been thoroughly vetted by multiple independent teams," Eleanor replied smoothly. "Miss Wilson's expertise in risk assessment is precisely why she's valuable to Sterling, and why her perspective on current market conditions is relevant to our discussions today." With that diplomatic brush off, the meeting proceeded to the substantive issues. Sterling's legal team presented the revised acquisition offer, explaining that due diligence had revealed significant undisclosed risk factors that necessitated a reevaluation of Blair's valuation. When it was my turn to present, I focused entirely on the data, avoiding any reference to my personal history with Blair. I methodically demonstrated the structural weaknesses in their investment portfolio, the regulatory compliance issues, and the likely client attrition they would face in the coming months. My presentation was clinical, precise, and devastating in its implications. Throughout my presentation, Richard shifted between expressions of fury and attempts at dismissive contempt. When I concluded, he was the first to speak. "This is absurd," he declared. "These projections are based on worst-case scenarios that have virtually no probability of occurring. Sterling is obviously using these manufactured concerns to justify a lowball offer." Benjamin responded with practiced calm. "Our analysis is based on standard risk assessment methodologies applied to the actual investment structures currently in place at Blair. If you disagree with specific elements of the assessment, we're happy to review your counter-analysis." "This is nothing but a personal vendetta," Richard insisted, gesturing toward me. "Miss Wilson was terminated from Blair for performance issues and has clearly poisoned your perspective out of spite." Eleanor's voice remained level but took on a steely quality. "Mr. Anderson, our offer is based on verified financial data provided by your own organization during due diligence, analyzed using industry-standard methodologies. If you'd like to dispute specific findings, please do so, with data rather than personal attacks." Blair's CEO, looking increasingly uncomfortable, intervened. "Perhaps we should take a brief recess to discuss these findings privately." The Blair team retreated to a separate room, leaving us to wait. Benjamin gave me a reassuring nod. "Perfectly handled," he whispered. "Professional and unimpeachable." When the Blair team returned 30 minutes later, the dynamic had visibly shifted. Richard was notably silent while the board chairman took the lead. After reviewing Sterling's analysis, we acknowledged that certain risk factors may have been underappreciated in our internal assessments, he said carefully. We're prepared to continue acquisition discussions with some adjustments to the proposed terms. The negotiation that followed was tense but productive. By the end of the day, a preliminary agreement had been reached. Sterling would acquire Blair at approximately 40% of its valuation from 6 months earlier, with certain performance contingencies that could slightly increase the final price if specific client retention targets were met. As the meeting concluded and people gathered their materials, Richard approached me while others were distracted with goodbyes. "You think you've won," he said in a low voice, "but you've destroyed your professional reputation. No one trusts a traitor." I met his gaze calmly. "I didn't betray Blair, Richard. I tried to protect it, and you fired me for it. Everything that's happened since is the natural consequence of your decisions, not mine." Before he could respond, Benjamin appeared at my side, ready to head back to the office. "Mercedes, we have that strategy call at 5. As we left the hotel, I felt an overwhelming sense of closure. The acquisition wasn't yet finalized, but the power dynamic had been irrevocably shifted. Richard's reign of arrogance was ending, and a new chapter was beginning not just for me, but for all the colleagues I had left behind at Blair. 6 months after that fateful meeting at the Four Seasons, I sat in what had once been Richard Anderson's corner office, now mine as the executive director of the newly formed Blair division of Sterling Financial. The integration of the two companies had been completed ahead of schedule with minimal client attrition, thanks to proactive communication and relationship management. Richard, unsurprisingly, had not been offered a position in the new organization. According to office gossip, he had secured a much less prestigious role at a smaller firm in Minneapolis, far from the financial hub of Chicago, where his reputation had been irreparably damaged. My first acts as executive director had focused on cultural transformation. The fear-based management style that had defined Blair under Richard's leadership was systematically dismantled. I established open communication channels, anonymous feedback mechanisms, and clear merit-based advancement criteria. Most importantly, I created an environment where raising concerns was viewed as a valuable contribution rather than an act of disloyalty. Many familiar faces remained. Lisa had been promoted to marketing director, her creativity finally given the recognition it deserved. James now led an expanded IT department with a focus on data security and analytics. Some of the analysts who had left during Richard's tenure had been recruited back, bringing valuable institutional knowledge and fresh perspectives from their experiences elsewhere. One Tuesday morning, I arrived to find an unexpected email in my inbox. The sender was Richard Anderson. I hesitated before opening it, unsure what to expect after 6 months of silence. "Mercedes, I've had time to reflect on the events leading to Blair's acquisition. While we will likely never agree on all points, I must acknowledge that your risk assessment was ultimately proven correct. The flaws in our investment structure were real and would have led to more severe consequences without intervention. This admission comes too late to change outcomes, but perhaps it offers some vindication. Richard." The email contained no apology for his treatment of me, no acknowledgement of the sexist comments or professional sabotage. Yet the admission that I had been right was more than I had ever expected to receive from him. I chose not to respond, seeing no benefit in reopening old wounds. His acknowledgement changed nothing about my path forward, but it did provide a certain symmetry to the story's conclusion. That evening I invited Lisa and James for drinks at a rooftop bar overlooking the city. As we watched the sunset paint Chicago's skyline in vibrant oranges and pinks, Lisa raised her glass. "To Mercedes, who showed us all what courage looks like," she said. "And to second chances," James added. "For all of us." I smiled, feeling a profound sense of gratitude and accomplishment. "To integrity," I replied, "and its surprising rewards." Later that night, alone in my apartment, I reflected on the extraordinary journey of the past year. From the devastating moment of being fired to now leading the very organization that had rejected me, the experience had transformed me in ways I was still discovering. I had learned that doing the right thing might indeed cost you in the short term, just as my mother had said, but the foundation of integrity would support you in ways you couldn't anticipate. I had learned that sometimes the best response to injustice isn't immediate revenge, but patient, principled action that creates meaningful change. Perhaps most importantly, I had learned that true leadership isn't about control or never being questioned, as Richard had believed. It was about creating environments where truth could be spoken without fear, where collective wisdom could flourish, and where purpose aligned with principles. The acquisition of Blair wasn't just a personal vindication or career advancement. It represented an opportunity to transform a toxic culture into something healthier, to demonstrate in practice that financial success and ethical behavior weren't opposing forces but complementary strengths. There were still challenges ahead. Some of Blair's client relationships remained fragile. The integration of different organizational cultures was ongoing. My new role brought responsibilities and pressures I was still learning to navigate, but for the first time in my career, I felt complete alignment between my personal values and my professional path. As I looked out at the city lights, I thought about all the other people facing similar moments of choice in their careers. Those moments when standing for what's right seems impossibly costly. Those crossroads where the easy path of compromise beckons with immediate rewards while the harder path of integrity offers no guarantees. My story had turned out better than I could have imagined, but the real victory wasn't in ending up in the corner office. It was in knowing that when faced with the choice between easy wrong and difficult right, I had chosen correctly. That knowledge would sustain me through whatever challenges came next. Have you ever faced a situation where standing up for what's right came at a personal cost? I'd love to hear your experiences in the comments below. Sometimes knowing we're not alone in these struggles gives us the courage to make the harder choice. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe to hear more journeys of personal and professional growth. And share this with someone who might need a reminder that integrity, while sometimes costly in the short term, creates foundations for success that manipulation and fear never can. Thank you for listening to my story. And remember, your principles are always your most valuable asset, no matter what anyone else might tell you.